May 1945. The guns on the European battlefield fell silent. The Nazi German Empire collapsed in a sea of fire and ashes. Across the Atlantic, the United States, a nation that had played a decisive role in the Allied victory, entered the post-war era with a peculiar legacy. More than 370,000 German prisoners of war scattered across 511 camps throughout the U.S., from the deserts of New Mexico to the cornfields of Iowa. For many Americans, they were merely remnants of a past conflict, defeated enemies waiting to be sent back to their devastated homeland. But for the prisoners themselves, the war was far from over. With the fall of Nazi Germany, Europe's map was redrawn along the victors' lines. Many rural regions where they had been born, East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, or the Sudetenland, fell under Soviet and Polish control. For hundreds of thousands of prisoners from these areas, the red flag of the Red Army was not a symbol of liberation, but a harbinger of another nightmare: punishment, torture, and exile. When the Allied Repatriation Commission began taking stock, roughly 123,000 German prisoners in the U.S. were classified as having homes located in Soviet-controlled territory. Under the Yalta Agreement, they were to be returned to their original homelands. For the Soviet Union, this was an opportunity for retribution. Anyone who had worn a Wehrmacht uniform, regardless of rank, was deemed a war criminal. News from Europe cast a shadow of panic over U.S. camps. Reports spoke of prisoners in the East being forced to march hundreds of kilometers, beaten, coerced into false confessions, with many never returning. In the diary of a German officer at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, a hurried note reads, "If we return to Silesia, it is a death sentence." Fear spread, and it intensified with each passing day. Some began feigning mental illness, hoping to stay in the U.S. for treatment. Others falsified their hometowns, changed village or province names, or claimed to be Austrian, knowing Austrian prisoners were repatriated to the British-occupied zone, a safer place. The most desperate resorted to extreme measures, hanging themselves or slitting their wrists at night to avoid ever boarding the ship eastward. At larger camps such as Camp Hearn, Texas, or Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, U.S. military police recorded dozens of suicides in 1946 alone. Internal reports described an atmosphere of chaos and extreme tension among the prisoners. They were no longer the obstinate enemies of Nazi Germany, but people trapped between two worlds, without a homeland, without faith, uncertain of the future. Ironically, in the eyes of many Americans, they were some of the easiest prisoners to manage. Unlike wartime propaganda images, most German POWs were treated relatively humanely. They were fed well, had scheduled sports, learned English, read books, and even attended democracy and governance classes organized by university professors. Many began to sense that beyond the barbed wire, they were living in a different society, one where people were governed by law rather than hatred. Some prisoners wrote home, "We have learned here that freedom is not a slogan, but an order based on justice." Yet this humane treatment deepened their psychological tragedy. The more they experienced freedom, the more terrified they were of returning to lost lands where families might be forcibly relocated, homes confiscated, and they would be considered criminals in the victors' eyes. Thousands petitioned the U.S. government to stay, but none were granted permission. The U.S. was bound by international agreements, and relations with the Soviet Union were still in the Allied victors phase. Washington did not want a diplomatic crisis over anonymous German soldiers. By December 1945, the first trains began transporting prisoners from Midwest camps to the port of Newport News, Virginia, in preparation for repatriation. When the lists were announced, hundreds slated for transfer to the Soviet Union rebelled simultaneously. At Fort Eustis, they ransacked warehouses, burned documents, and went on hunger strikes. Military police resorted to tear gas. A U.S. sergeant recalled, "We didn't understand. They were so terrified, it was as if they were being led to a crematorium." Some decided to flee. U.S. War Department records document at least 2,222 escape attempts from POW camps on American soil between 1942 and 1946. Most were recaptured, but some disappeared entirely. The most famous among them was Georg Gärtner, a young soldier who had served in North Africa. Learning that his home in Silesia was now part of Poland and that all Germans were being expelled, he realized returning meant death. One night in September 1945, Gärtner cut through the fence at Camp Deming, New Mexico, and fled into the desert. He lived for 40 years under the alias Dennis F. Wiles, working as a laborer, truck driver, and technician in California. Only when the war became a distant memory did he appear on television in 1985 to recount his journey. U.S. authorities declared that, with the statute of limitations expired and Germany no longer existing in its former form, Gärtner could not be prosecuted. In 2009, he was granted U.S. citizenship, closing one of the most extraordinary post-war stories. Meanwhile, most prisoners continued to wait anxiously. Some wrote letters pleading to be sent to the British or French zones. Others tried converting to Christianity or claiming to be anti-fascist to have their cases reconsidered. Many received help from American priests and ministers, intervening to prevent transfer to the Soviets. In some cases, farmers who had employed prisoners for seasonal work advocated on their behalf, pleading, "Let them stay. They are honest people." Yet bureaucracy and diplomatic pressures rendered these efforts futile. During those long months of waiting, U.S. POW camps became small, quasi-autonomous communities. Classes were organized, choirs formed, soccer teams established, and even internal newspapers printed. Many prisoners began to reflect on themselves, once believers in the Third Reich, now learning to understand the world through the lens of democracy. In American political thought classes, they learned about the Constitution, human rights, and freedom of the press. Some later recalled, "It was in the U.S. camps that I truly learned the meaning of Freiheit, freedom." When the war ended, fear still clung to them, but within it was an awakening. They began to realize that while the war had taken their homeland, it had also given them something else, a glimpse of a society they had once regarded as an enemy. And in a strange historical paradox, German POWs after World War II discovered in America something they had never had at home: humanity and faith in mankind. By the end of 1946, the curtain of war had fallen for most Americans. Soldiers reunited with their families, the United States entered a consumer-driven era, and people eagerly tried to forget the years of smoke and fire. But in remote lands, beyond barbed wire and silent guard towers, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war still lived in limbo, no longer soldiers, but not yet free. They were remnants of a conflict the world was trying to forget, and it was in that void that the first sparks of resistance began to flare. From late 1945, POW camps across the U.S. were ordered to prepare for large-scale repatriation. The U.S. Army coordinated with the War Department and Allied commissions to classify prisoners. Thousands were sent to East Coast ports, where British and American naval vessels awaited to carry them back to Europe. But for many, especially those from the East, each newly announced repatriation list felt like a death sentence. They heard of comrades handed over to the Soviets, who then vanished forever. Rumors traveled faster than official reports. Prisoners were sent to Siberian camps, forced to work in coal mines, or executed for counter-revolutionary crimes. Fear turned into despair, and from despair came resistance. The first protests arose at large camps such as Camp Swift, Texas, Fort Eustis, Virginia, and Camp Shanks, New York, where groups of prisoners were about to be transferred. At Fort Eustis in December 1945, a group of German officers staged a 7-day hunger strike to protest their repatriation to the Soviet Union. They claimed to be Austrian or from territories now under British control. When U.S. military police intervened, some cut their wrists with glass, while others used improvised knives to attempt suicide. War Department reports noted serious psychological disturbances and organized opposition. The Army had to set up special investigation teams to verify each prisoner's background, a nearly impossible task, as many German records had been destroyed during the war. Beyond hunger strikes or falsifying records, some prisoners sabotaged administrative processes. At Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, hundreds of forms were deliberately misspelled or listed non-existent villages. At Camp Hearn, Texas, former Luftwaffe officers secretly forged maps, planned escapes, and even sent letters to humanitarian organizations in Switzerland requesting intervention. While most plans were uncovered, they reflected the growing frustration among the prisoner community. They no longer trusted anyone, not the new Germany, not the Allies, not that justice would protect them. In this tense atmosphere, escapes became more frequent. U.S. Army statistics show that from 1942 to the end of 1946, there were at least 2,222 escape attempts, most occurring after the war. Some were impulsive, prisoners looking to escape for a few days to get alcohol or see the world beyond the barbed wire. Others were meticulously planned, demonstrating astonishing calculation and persistence. One of the first post-war escapes occurred at Camp Grant, Illinois. In September 1945, two prisoners, Carl Müller and Erich Heine, sawed through the bars of a shower, escaped through a sewer, and hid in the woods for 3 weeks before being caught. When questioned, Müller said only, "I am not afraid of hunger, I am afraid of returning." The interrogating officer was silent, later noting in his report that their desperation may indeed be justified. The most famous and strangest escape was that of Georg Gärtner, a young soldier who had fought in North Africa with Rommel's Afrika Korps. When Germany surrendered, Gärtner was sent to Camp Deming in the New Mexico desert. His records listed his hometown as Schweidnitz, Silesia, a territory annexed by Poland after the war. He knew that if repatriated, he would have no home to return to, and the German population there was being forcibly expelled. One September night in 1945, taking advantage of a sandstorm, Gärtner cut through the barbed wire and vanished into the desert. He walked tens of kilometers, stole civilian clothes, and boarded a westbound freight train. For many years, he lived under the alias Dennis F. Wiles, working on railroads and construction projects in California. His story only emerged in 1985, when he appeared on American television, revealing his true identity after 40 years in hiding. He recounted that although he had never committed a crime or been pursued, every night at the sound of a train whistle, he would startle, fearing recapture. In 2009, the United States granted him citizenship, ending the longest escape saga in World War II POW history. Beyond Gärtner, dozens of lesser-known stories exist, equally tragic. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, a prisoner named Otto Schluter escaped to seek relatives in Canada, but was caught crossing the border. In Utah, a group of 3 escaped successfully, working on a farm for years before turning themselves in during the 1950s. Some fled not for ideology, but simply because they had integrated into American life and did not want to leave. Many were sheltered by locals who had employed them on farms during the war and trusted and liked them. Alongside these escapes was a quiet wave of internal resistance. Some prisoners, particularly officers and intellectuals, organized political education groups to convince U.S. military authorities that they were anti-fascist and supported democracy. They formed rehabilitation committees, voluntarily teaching fellow prisoners about the U.S. Constitution and individual freedoms, demonstrating that they deserved to stay. Camps such as Camp Concordia, Kansas, and Camp Ruston, Louisiana, became centers of cultural exchange where prisoners performed music, painted, wrote newspapers, and interacted with local citizens. These activities served both as pastime and subtle resistance, proving that, even as prisoners, they retained dignity. The U.S. military observed these changes but still had to follow official policy. Camp officers sometimes sympathized, delaying repatriation under excuses of incomplete paperwork or awaiting transport. Yet pressure from the Soviet Union grew. Moscow continually demanded the return of German citizens from Soviet-controlled areas, viewing any delay as hostile. In April 1946, the U.S. War Department ordered a full census of camps, creating detailed lists of every prisoner. This triggered a new wave of resistance. At Fort Eustis, hundreds refused to submit records, declaring, "We'd rather die in America than live in Russia." Military police were forced to use force to board them onto ships. At least 8 prisoners committed suicide in the following weeks, a small number but indicative of the widespread psychological crisis. In response, the U.S. issued Emergency Order 411, increasing security, controlling information, and segregating prisoners showing anti-repatriation tendencies. Camps were sectioned off, and the most agitated inmates were isolated. Yet escapes continued. Each successful flight became a legend within the prisoner community, proof that freedom could still be seized, even if only for a moment. By summer 1946, the U.S. had largely completed the repatriation of prisoners. But in some remote camps, a few hundred continued to resist, holding out until the last moment. A U.S. officer's diary at Camp Shanks noted, "We defeated Germany, but could not subdue the fear in these men's hearts." Looking back, the escapes and resistance of German POWs in America were not tales of obstinate enemies, but tragedies of people crushed between two powers. They no longer fought for Hitler, but for the right to survive, for hope of being free. And in this adversity, those labeled prisoners became the most vivid testament to the value of freedom that America has always believed in. When the guns fell silent in Europe, the United States entered the post-war era facing a different challenge: how to revive the economy and maintain production while millions of young Americans were still overseas or had yet to return to civilian life. The war had left empty fields, understaffed factories, and an enormous demand for food and materials to feed a shattered Europe. In this context, a special labor force was retained and utilized. Over 370,000 German prisoners of war scattered across the U.S. They became a silent yet vital part of the post-war economic engine. When the U.S. began receiving German POWs in 1943, the initial goal was merely secure detention. But within months, the War Department realized that the camps held a vast labor resource. With American men at the front, Southern and Midwestern farms were critically understaffed. Many farm owners appealed to the government, and by mid-1944, the authorities allowed German prisoners to perform civilian labor, provided it involved no weapons or classified work. This marked the beginning of a little-known chapter in American agricultural history, a chapter of workers without freedom who nonetheless helped sustain a nation. POW camps quickly became labor supply centers. In Texas, groups of prisoners were sent to harvest cotton and corn. In California, they picked fruit and canned vegetables. In Idaho and Oregon, they harvested potatoes and sugar beets. During the 1945 harvest, Idaho alone employed over 8,000 prisoners full-time on farms and in food processing plants. One of the biggest beneficiaries was J.R. Simplot Company, producing dehydrated potatoes for the military. German prisoners in Simplot factories helped maintain food supplies for millions of U.S. soldiers. Later, after the war, J.R. Simplot became the first supplier of French fries to McDonald's, a link in the global fast food chain, originating from the labor of anonymous POWs. Statistics show that between 1943 and 1946, German POWs in the U.S. worked a total of over 90 million man-days, generating an estimated economic value of $230 million in 1945 dollars, equivalent to billions today. They harvested 939 million pounds of vegetables, 568 million pounds of fruit, and hundreds of millions of pounds of grains. Each prisoner earned a nominal wage of about 80 cents per day, but the money did not go directly to them. It was recorded in U.S. government accounts, minus the cost of food, housing, and administration. In exchange, prisoners received a small allowance to buy cigarettes, soap, or personal items at the camp store. Yet most did not complain. For many, being outside the barbed wire, breathing free air, and working among ordinary people was reward enough. They felt treated as humans rather than enemies. In many areas, Americans showed more kindness to German prisoners than expected. Local farmers brought cold water, bread, and coffee during lunch breaks. In some places, children played ball with the German soldiers in their yards. This humanity led many prisoners to see America differently. They realized that the enemy they had been taught to hate was not a monster, but a practical, fair, and generous people. Not everyone welcomed this reality. American labor unions began to protest vigorously, claiming POWs were stealing jobs from American citizens. In Michigan, the International Labor Federation organized demonstrations, demanding, "Send the prisoners back to Germany to make room for returning veterans." Newspapers ran sharp editorials asking, "Why are the men who fought against us earning wages while our sons remain unemployed?" Facing public pressure, the U.S. government adjusted policy. Prisoners could work only in sectors with severe labor shortages, and their wages were set below minimum levels to avoid competition. Even so, German POWs remained the backbone of agricultural production in many states. Without them, many harvests might have failed. After the war, repatriation of prisoners plunged many American farmers into crisis. In Kansas and Texas, agricultural associations sent hundreds of letters to the War Department, pleading to retain at least one more year of this labor force. One Kansas farmer wrote, "If they leave, our fields will die." Internal government reports acknowledged that agricultural output in 1946 dropped significantly after prisoners were sent home. In some regions, authorities had to hire Mexican labor under the Bracero program to compensate, at a much higher cost. Some prisoners, loved by local communities, tried to stay. Many Americans wrote letters of support for kind German workers who had helped on their farms, hoping they could settle in the U.S. Most petitions were denied, but a few exceptions were made. Those who had saved lives during disasters or could prove they had been victims of the Nazi regime rather than supporters. Behind the dry statistics were thousands of small human stories. In Nebraska, a prisoner named Hans Richter saved an American child from drowning while working by a river. The child's family petitioned the government to let Richter stay. Though the request was denied, the families remained in contact for years, and when Richter died in Germany in 1980, the boy's son traveled to attend the funeral. In California, prisoner Carl Schreiber painted portraits for locals in exchange for bread and coffee. After the war, he returned to the U.S., opened an art studio in San Francisco, and became an American citizen. Few could have imagined that those who once bore arms against America would help drive one of the most robust periods in American agricultural history. Post-war USDA reports noted that thanks to prisoner labor, U.S. food production not only avoided decline, but actually increased 12% from 1943 to 1945. Their contribution helped sustain domestic supply and enabled America to provide food aid to Europe, laying the groundwork for the Marshall Plan. In a sense, German prisoners indirectly helped rebuild their own homeland through labor on foreign soil. Yet the master and prisoner relationship was not always smooth. Sporadic incidents of violence occurred, usually due to misunderstandings or prejudice. At a camp in Arkansas, a group of prisoners was attacked by locals after rumors spread that they had insulted the U.S. flag. Though authorities intervened quickly, the incident left deep psychological scars. A camp officer later wrote, "We realized that peace can be signed on paper, but to truly begin, it must grow from the hearts of people." By the end of 1946, as most prisoners were repatriated, many American farmers organized small farewell gatherings. Some presented souvenirs, wrote letters, and took photographs together. These images, American farmers with German POWs in cornfields, smiling under the sun, still remain in museums in Kansas, Texas, and Idaho. They are simple yet profound. Between two people once on opposite sides, only friendship and gratitude remained. Returning to Europe, many former German prisoners recalled that in the U.S., they had learned not only modern farming techniques and machinery operation, but also the concepts of free labor and human dignity. They carried memories of working on American soil as a warm recollection amid the dark years of war. Some later returned legally to the U.S., saying they wished to repay America for teaching us about freedom, even while we were prisoners. In American history, the contribution of German POWs was once a forgotten chapter. Looking back, however, it reveals a deeply human paradox. While war is remembered with bombs and hatred, the same soldiers imprisoned helped build peace through the most ordinary work: planting, harvesting, laboring. They were not only prisoners of war, but also anonymous workers in a reborn economy. And somewhere amid America's vast fields, traces of their efforts remain. In the grains, the potatoes, and in the memories of those who witnessed the moment when enemies became collaborators on the path to recovery. When the war ended, the barbed wire fences surrounding German POW camps in the United States did more than separate the defeated from the free world. They divided thousands of people between longing, hope, and forbidden love. It was a strange period in American history, when those once considered enemies of the nation became part of everyday life. and when love, compassion, and humanitarian impulses began to bloom between people from opposite sides of the battlefield. In 1945, the United States welcomed its first spring of peace. But inside the POW camps, that sense of calm did not come easily. News of Germany in ruins, of cities flattened by bombs, of shattered families left tens of thousands of prisoners torn between despair and hope. They did not know whether their parents, wives, or children were alive. Some received letters from home through the Red Cross, trembling pages written in pencil describing hardship and hunger. Others never heard from their families again. For them, America was both a temporary refuge and an inescapable prison. In this context, American humanitarian organizations intervened. The Red Cross and Quakers advocated for prisoners to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, allowed to receive letters, provided medical care, and, most importantly, treated as human beings. Camp officers, after months of supervising prisoners, gradually realized that many German POWs were merely young men swept up in the machinery of war, not fanatical Nazis. An officer at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, wrote in his journal, "I see in their eyes no hatred anymore, only longing and the desire to return home." Yet not all prisoners had a home to return to. Hundreds from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, regions now under Soviet control, learned that their homelands had been erased from Germany's map and that family members were expelled or missing. For them, returning meant facing labor camps in Siberia, or worse, death. News that the Soviets were punishing traitors who had surrendered to the West drove many prisoners to despair. Some cut their wrists in camps, while others escaped, attempting to blend into American communities. Amid this uncertainty, human connections began to form. In rural areas where prisoners were assigned to work, they interacted with locals, farm owners, laborers, and sometimes young American women. Initial encounters were cautious, but over time, kindness bridged the gap. Some women brought water to prisoners in the summer heat, others taught them a few English phrases, and some tucked bread or small notes into their pockets. Despite strict prohibitions, quiet romances sprouted like seeds growing in dry soil. A well-known story is that of Erica and Hans Meyer in Arkansas in 1945. Erica, the daughter of a German immigrant farmer, met Hans, a POW working the cotton fields. They communicated across wooden fences during shared labor. When the war ended, Hans was sent back to Germany. 2 years later, Erica attempted to contact him by letter. And in 1949, after persistent effort, Hans received a visa to the U.S., and they married in Little Rock. Local newspapers described their story as proof that love can transcend borders. Not all such romances had happy endings. Many American women were shunned for loving the enemy, losing jobs, or facing family opposition. For them, affection for German men was not only love, but also a quiet rebellion against wartime hatred. Some women became pregnant before POWs were repatriated, leaving hundreds of children of mixed heritage, officially fatherless in records, yet living symbols of silent reconciliation between two peoples. These children often grew up unaware of their origins, only discovering the truth decades later through letters or old documents. For the prisoners, these relationships were rare bright spots in years of confinement. They found in the eyes of American women the understanding that war had taken from them. A prisoner, Wilhelm Schultz, wrote in his journal, "We came here as enemies, but she looked at me as a human being." Back in Germany, Schultz could not forget a young American woman named Mary who had taught him to sing, "You Are My Sunshine." Many years later, he named his daughter Maria, to preserve that little light in the darkness. Yet love could not erase the humanitarian wounds inflicted by the POW system. Thousands suffered severe psychological trauma, survivors' guilt, shame for being captured, and uncertainty about the future. Many returning home faced suspicion from fellow citizens, labeled as traitors or accused of surrendering too soon. In East Germany, the Soviet authorities forced many former POWs to write confessions and undergo labor re-education. Some were barred from government jobs and monitored for life. In contrast, in the United States, memories of German POWs gradually faded. But some farming families could not forget their friends from the other side of the line. Many sent letters of thanks to Germany, often including photos and occasionally small gifts or money. In Texas, one farmer still keeps a pocket watch given by a POW before returning home engraved with, "Thank you for treating me like a human being." By the 1950s, as U.S.-German relations normalized, some former POWs returned to America as legal immigrants. About 5,000 chose to settle in the country that once held them captive. Some married women they had met during the war. Others visited former farm owners and the places where they had worked. In Kansas, a small festival in 1965 commemorated 20 years of freedom, with former POWs and locals sharing meals, telling old stories, and singing songs. Hatred was gone, replaced by shared memories of a time when humanity found its way between ruins. Alongside these human stories lies a profound lesson about the psychological and moral consequences of war. German POWs, even without torture or execution in America, faced invisible wounds, loss of identity, the tension between guilt and gratitude. Some historians call this the tragedy of the defeated soldier in a free world, treated kindly, yet never forgetting that he was once an invader. This awareness led many later to become strong voices for peace, reconciliation, and the rejection of extremism. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, as documents were declassified, Americans began to openly recall this period. Documentaries, memoirs, and novels told stories of POW romances with American women, beautiful memories intertwined with pain. One notable work was the 1987 film The Good German Prisoner, based on a true story of a German soldier returning to the U.S. to reunite with the woman who had sheltered him. The film was more than a love story. It carried a humanist message. Compassion can flourish on both sides of war. Today, in many small American towns, traces of German POW camps remain, sometimes only weathered plaques or photographs in local museums. But memories of the POWs live on in stories passed down through generations, of soldiers who laid down their arms, of women who dared to love the enemy, and of a nation proving that humanity can endure even amid the deepest wounds of history. Looking back, we see that war destroys not only through bombs, but also by testing morality and trust. German POWs in the U.S. Eckstein, with all their pain, hope, and forbidden love, left a quiet legacy. That even in captivity, humans can find one another through compassion. Perhaps it is from these forbidden loves, these small acts of kindness, that the seeds of true peace were planted. Not in treaties or slogans, but in the hearts of those who once stood on opposite sides of the war's walls. When the last trains carrying German POWs left New York Harbor in 1946, the United States believed the final chapter of the story of hundreds of thousands of imprisoned soldiers had closed. Yet in reality, it was only the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of memory, reconciliation, and the quiet transformation in the perceptions of two peoples who had once faced each other in the bloodiest war of the 20th century. In the post-war years, the image of the German soldier in the eyes of Americans gradually shifted, from dangerous enemy to human being from the other side. And it was these POWs, together with those who had come into contact with them, who helped create a unique legacy, a legacy of empathy, learning, and turning enmity into friendship. Returning to Europe, many former German POWs carried with them a completely different image of America. They did not just remember the barbed wire fences or sweltering camps, but also the people who treated them with rare kindness amid chaos. In memoirs published in Germany in the late 1940s, numerous POWs recounted that it was in the U.S. camps that they first learned about democracy, read freely, and participated in discussions without fear of punishment. One wrote, "We came as victims of propaganda and left as people who understood what freedom truly meant." Recognizing this potential, the U.S. government skillfully turned POW camps into laboratories of thought for human re-education. At many camps, classes were offered in English, American history, philosophy, and even vocational skills. Moderate German officers were encouraged to lead discussions on democracy and civic responsibility. The curricula, prepared by the U.S. military, were human-centered, not imposed, but designed to inspire. They aimed to plant a new concept in the minds of young soldiers that power lies not in violence, but in freedom and the rule of law. Years later, when the Federal Republic of Germany was founded in 1949, some former POWs who had been in the U.S. became civil servants, educators, and even parliamentarians. They carried with them lessons learned behind bars, organizational skills, respect for law, and a desire to build a just society. Some historians call this the POW effect. The experience of hundreds of thousands of German POWs exposed directly to the American democratic model contributed to shaping the post-war political culture of Germany. In their memory, America was no longer the enemy, but a model to emulate. Not all POWs returned to Europe, however. About 5,000 eventually came back to the U.S., this time legally. Some were sponsored by farming families, others came for work or study. They became U.S. citizens, carrying with them memories of their years of captivity. One of the most famous cases was Georg Gärtner, who had escaped from a POW camp in New Mexico in 1945. He lived anonymously for 40 years under another name, worked as a construction engineer, married an American woman, and only revealed his true identity in 1985. Instead of punishment, he was forgiven and later naturalized as an American citizen. His story became a symbol of America's capacity for tolerance, a place where a former enemy could become a citizen. Behind these personal stories was a larger transformation. The U.S.-Germany relationship shifted from confrontation to alliance. When the Cold War erupted, the U.S. quickly recognized the importance of a strong West Germany to counter the Soviet Union. Millions of dollars flowed into the Marshall Plan, rebuilding the West German economy. In this wave of cooperation, memories of German POWs who had worked on American soil were reconsidered, not as a wartime blemish, but as a successful example of humane treatment. 1950s American newspapers sometimes recalled the image of former German soldiers returning as friends, demonstrating that peace could be built through compassion, not only treaties. In Germany, the memory also left a deep mark. Many former POWs wrote memoirs and sent letters of thanks to Americans who had treated them kindly. In a 1957 letter published in Die Zeit, a former officer named Otto Müller wrote, "We came to America with the pride of the defeated, but Americans taught us humility without humiliation. They showed us that true strength lies in compassion." From words like these, a new generation of Germans grew up with a different view of a former adversary, and Germany gradually became America's closest ally in Europe. In the U.S., the physical remnants of POW camps gradually faded. Many sites became schools, parks, or factories. Yet in a few small towns, traces were preserved: a stone marker, a row of trees planted by prisoners, or a small building that had once been a barracks. At Camp Hearn in Texas, locals established a small museum displaying photographs, diaries, and crafts made by POWs. On an old wooden plaque, someone had carved, "They came as prisoners and left as men of peace." Many Americans who had lived near the camps recalled that the presence of German POWs changed the way they viewed war. They realized that the enemy could laugh, sing, and miss home. Children who grew up in towns with camps often said they learned their first lesson in humanity by seeing their fathers bring food to POWs or their mothers wash their clothes. Perhaps it was from these small acts that a generation of Americans came to understand that true peace begins with how we treat the defeated. The 1980s and 1990s saw a wave of remembrance. Many former POWs returned to visit old camps and reconnect with local residents. Some brought grandchildren to show them where they slept and worked. Franz Weber, once imprisoned in Kansas, returned 45 years later and stood in a cornfield saying, "I lost my freedom here, but also found faith in humanity in this very place." American reporters captured this moment as a symbol of full reconciliation, where war ended not only with victory, but with forgiveness. From a broader perspective, the experience of German POWs in the U.S. helped establish global humanitarian standards for treating prisoners. Compared to camps in Europe or Asia, U.S. camps were considered exemplary, strictly adhering to the Geneva Conventions and even exceeding minimum requirements. After the war, UN experts studied this model for application in future conflicts. This legacy, the humane treatment of even an enemy, became one of the rare bright spots in 20th century warfare. Yet perhaps the deepest legacy is not found in textbooks or official records, but in the memories of those who lived it. In a 1991 interview, Ruth Henderson, daughter of an Oklahoma farmer, recalled, "My father always said, 'When you see a prisoner, don't forget they once had a family.' I grew up with that, and I have always believed that compassion is what sets us apart from war." Such simple words testify to the lasting impact German POWs had on the hearts of Americans. By the 21st century, very few WWII POWs remained alive. They became living witnesses to a time when the line between friend and foe blurred, replaced by the human bond. Historians call them silent ambassadors of peace, demonstrating that even in the darkness of war, humanity can find its light. And perhaps that is their greatest legacy. Not the statistics of labor or economic value, but the lesson that true victory does not come from defeating one's opponent, but from seeing oneself reflected in the enemy. America taught that lesson through action, and German POWs, through gratitude and transformation, continued it. From behind barbed wire, they emerged not just as freed prisoners, but as citizens of a new world, where peace cannot be imposed, but only nurtured through compassion.